The face in the window was not a trick of the light or a smudge on the lens. It was a grinning, elongated face staring directly at my mother. I sat on the floor of our living room in Laguna, clutching the old Polaroid so tightly the edges dug into my palms. The house was quiet, save for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a tricycle passing on the main road outside. My mother was sitting across from me, her face pale as she stared at the image. It was a photo from 1994, taken just 3 years after we moved into this estate. In it, my parents stood in front of our front door, smiling for the camera, while my younger brother and I were perched on their shoulders. We looked happy. The house behind us was beautiful, a sprawling colonial-style structure with thick concrete walls and heavy wooden doors. But there, in the upper pane of the window just above my father's head, was that face. It was pale, almost gray, and its mouth was pulled back in an expression of impossible joy. I didn't recognize it, neither did my parents. We had lived here for 20 years, and we know every inch of this property. The house sat on a sprawling plot of land that had once belonged to a wealthy landowner who had died with a very large family, or so the local gossip went. People in town whispered about how the ground was heavy and why the construction had taken so long. They said the old cemetery beneath the foundation was never properly cleared before the concrete was poured. We didn't believe them, of course. You don't believe stories like that unless you want to live in fear every time you turn off a light. But looking at that face, a deep unease settled in my bones. It wasn't just that it was there, it was the way it seemed to be watching us specifically. It didn't look like a ghost from the movie. It looked like something that had been waiting in the rafters for decades, finally caught by the flash of a camera. My mother reached out and touched my hand. Her fingers were trembling. She told me she hadn't noticed it until I pointed it out today. She said that every time she looked at that photo before, she thought it was just a knot in the wood or a reflection of a tree branch outside. But now that I had blown it up and printed it, there was no hiding it. It was clear. The eyes were hollow pits, and the grin reached back toward the ears. I stood up and walked to that very window. It was an old wooden frame, heavy and imposing. I touched the glass, which was thick enough to muffle the outside world. For a moment, I felt that I was looking through history. The house breathed with us. Every creak of the floorboards and every groan of the wood seemed like a sigh from something ancient. I looked up at the pane where the figure had appeared in the photo. In the present day, there was nothing there but the afternoon shadows casting long shapes across the interior. Yet my skin crawled as if something were pressing against the other side of the glass. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the house settle. It wasn't just a house. It felt like an organism. The walls seemed thick with memories and secrets. My parents had always been firm about not going into the basement during the day because the air down there was heavy, but they never mentioned why. They just said it was for safety. I began to wonder what they were protecting us from or what they were trying to keep contained. I grabbed a flashlight and slipped out of my room. The hallway was a tunnel of shadows. I made my way toward the basement door. The wood felt cold under my touch. Every step I took on the stairs felt like an intrusion. I reached the bottom and clicked on the light. The beam cut through the dust motes, illuminating the damp stone walls. This part of the house was built directly over the old foundations. They had tried to cap it off, but the ground here felt different, colder, nor solid, as if the earth itself were trying to hold something down. I walked toward the back corner where the foundation met the dirt. There, tucked away under a pile of old construction debris, was a small stone slab that didn't match the rest of the masonry. It was cracked and weathered. I knelt beside it, my heart pounding with a frantic beat. In the center of the slab was an inscription in a language I couldn't read, but the symbols looked jagged, but they had been carved in haste. As I moved closer, I heard a sound. It wasn't a noise from outside. It was a soft, wet, sliding sound coming from behind the wall, like something heavy and moist moving through a narrow space. I froze. A sharp intake of breath caught in my throat. The silence that followed was heavier than before. I stayed there for what felt like hours, my eyes fixed on the stone slab, waiting for something to emerge. I didn't see anything move, but I felt the gaze. It was the same sensation I had when looking at the photograph, the feeling of being watched by something that shouldn't have eyes, yet did. I realized then that the face in the window wasn't an intruder who had wandered into our backyard. It was something that lived inside the walls. It was part of the house's architecture now. The next morning, I showed the photo to my father. He didn't look at it for long before his face crumpled. He sat down in his chair and rubbed his eyes. He told me about the day they bought the land. He told me about the workers who had refused to work on the north side of the house, claiming the ground was cursed. He told me how he had ignored them because he wanted a home for his children. He admitted that sometimes, in the middle of the night, he would hear scratching, not the scurrying of rats or the scuttle of insects, but a deliberate, rhythmic scraping against the wood of the walls. He told me that he used to think it was just the house settling into the old cemetery grounds, but after seeing the photo, he confessed that he now knew better. The thing in the wall didn't care about the land, it only cared about the inhabitants. I went back to the living room and sat by the window again. I tried to think of it as a story, a piece of local folklore to keep me from panicking. But stories are for people who can afford to believe in fiction. When you see a face that doesn't belong to our world staring at you from a moment in your own past, the line between story and reality thins until it disappears. I started noticing things change around the house. Small things at first. A chair moved an inch to the left. A door that I had locked was found ajar, and then there were the marks. I found them on the ceiling of my bedroom, thin, shallow grooves in the plaster, as if someone had been dragging something heavy along the beams. They were shaped like long fingers. I began to spend more time looking at the photograph. I noticed that every day the face seemed a little closer to the glass. It was subtle, perhaps only by fractions of an inch, but it was there. It wasn't just a static image. The thing behind the camera lens, or rather, the thing inside the house, was reacting to my attention. It knew I was looking. My parents started acting strangely as well. They became withdrawn, spending more time in their rooms, speaking in hushed tones. They seemed afraid that if they spoke too loudly, something would hear them. They were trying to keep me away from certain parts of the house, but their warnings only made my curiosity sharper. I felt like a mouse in a maze, and they were trying to guide me toward the center without letting me see the walls closing in. One night, the power went out. The entire neighborhood was plunged into darkness. In our house, the silence became absolute. No hum of the fridge, no buzz of the lights. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. I could hear the house breathing a low, rhythmic groan of wood and stone. I reached for my phone to use as a flashlight, but before I could turn it on, I heard it. A soft, wet thud from the hallway. It was followed by another. Thump. Thump. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floorboards. It wasn't coming from the stairs. It was coming from the room next to mine, my parents' room. I stepped out into the hall, my heart hammering. I didn't turn on a light. I didn't want to be seen, but I wanted to see what was making that noise. I moved toward their door, my feet silent on the carpet. The smell hit me first. It wasn't just dust or old wood. It was the smell of damp earth and something metallic, like old blood. I reached their door and pressed my ear against the wood. From inside, I heard my mother's voice. She wasn't screaming, she was whispering, her voice thick with a terrifying kind of resignation. "It doesn't matter if we hide it," she whispered. "It knows where we are now." Then came a sound that stopped my heart. It was a low, guttural moan, like air being forced through a throat filled with fluid. It didn't sound human, but it had a cadence of intent. It was the sound of something trying to mimic a voice and failing miserably. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in short gasps. I retreated to my room and sat on the floor, burying my head in my arms. I stayed there until the sun began to creep through the curtains. What it did, the house returned to its normal state of stillness. But I knew better now. The stillness wasn't an absence of activity. It was a predator holding its breath. I went to the living room and looked at the photo again. My hands were shaking so much I could barely hold it. This time, when I looked at the window, I didn't just see the face. I saw movement. Or perhaps it was my imagination playing tricks on me in my exhausted state. The shadow behind the glass seemed to be shifting, as if something was moving behind the wall of the house. I walked to the window and pressed my face against the glass. The wood felt warm now, almost like skin. I looked at the space above my father's head in the photo and then up at the actual ceiling of the room. There, in the corner where the ceiling met the wall, was a small crack that hadn't been there yesterday. It was jagged and dark, looking like a mouth that had just opened. I realized then that the house wasn't haunted by something that died. It was inhabited by something that had never left. The cemetery beneath us hadn't buried it. It had only provided a home for it to wait. And now that we were here in this house and looking at that photo, it had found its way into our lives. I began to notice the small details of my own life changing. My friends stopped calling as much. I felt a strange heaviness in my limbs every afternoon. It was as if the house was drinking from me, slowly draining my energy to fuel whatever lived in the walls. The more I looked at the photo, the more it seemed to pull at my mind, weaving its presence into my thoughts until I couldn't tell what was mine and what belonged to it. One evening, I found a letter under the floorboards of the pantry. It was dated 1950, written by a man who had lived here before us. The handwriting was frantic, the ink smeared as if he had been crying while writing it. He spoke of the guest in the walls and how the house demanded a place for its visitor. He warned that once the stranger is seen, it becomes part of the family. It doesn't just want to live near you, it wants to become a part of your history, a shadow in your memories, a face in your photos. I clutched the letter to a chest, the paper crinkling in my hands. I realized then why my parents were so quiet. They weren't just afraid of what was in the house. They were trying to prevent it from taking over me completely. They were trying to keep its presence confined to the walls. But I had broken the seal by looking at that photo. By noticing the face, I had invited it into my consciousness. I looked out at the yard as the sun set behind the mountains of Laguna. The shadows were stretching long and thin across the grass. I could see the fence line, the old trees, and the distant lights of the neighboring houses. For a moment, I felt a sense of profound isolation. We were alone in this house, but we went alone in the silence. I went back to the living room where the photo sat on the table. The room was getting dark, and the shadows were lengthening. In the dim light, the face in the window seemed to change again. It wasn't just a still image anymore. It felt like it was watching me with real intent. I could almost see its eyes tracking my movement across the room. I sat down in the chair opposite the table and looked at it for a long time. I thought about our history, about the way we had moved here seeking peace and safety. We wanted a home, something solid and enduring. We got exactly what we asked for. We found a place that would hold us, but it also held someone else who had been waiting for a new host for centuries. I stood up and walked to the window one last time before I went to bed. I didn't look at the photo this time. I looked at the glass itself. There was a smudge on the interior of the pane, right where the face was in the photograph. It wasn't dirt. It was a thin film of something waxy and pale, like skin that had been pressed against the glass for so long it had fused with it. I reached out and touched it. The substance felt colder than the air outside. As my finger met the grime, I heard a sound from deep within the walls. It wasn't a groan or a hiss this time. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on a door in the distance. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from behind the wallpaper, just inches from my head. It was a deliberate, steady rhythm, as if something were testing the strength of the barrier between us. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I stayed perfectly still until the tapping stopped and the house fell into its nightly silence. The next morning, I found my mother standing in the kitchen, staring at me with eyes that looked tired and old. She didn't ask if I had slept well. She didn't mention the noise or the feeling of being watched. She just pointed toward the hallway and told me it was time for breakfast. But as I walked past her, I noticed something. On the kitchen wall, just above the refrigerator, there was a small piece of paper stuck with a magnet. It was a scrap from an old newspaper, and on it, someone had scrawled a single word in black ink, "Recognize." I looked back at the photo on the table in the living room. The face in the window wasn't just a shadow anymore. It seemed to have moved again. This time, it was no longer behind the glass of the upper pane. It appeared to be standing right against the frame, its fingers elongated and pale as they gripped the wood. I realized then that the house didn't want to be shared. It wanted to be full. Every time I looked at the photograph, I gave it a piece of myself, a bit of my memory, a sliver of my identity. It was feeding on my awareness of it. The more I recognized it, the more real it became in our world. I sat down at the kitchen table and took a sip of water. The house felt heavy today, the air thick with the weight of things unsaid. My father came in and sat across from me. He looked at me, and for a second I saw a flash of profound pity in his eyes. He knew what I had seen. He knew that once you see it, you can never unsee it. It becomes a part of your vision, like a ghost on the lens of your mind. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting bright light into the kitchen. The shadows retreated, but they didn't disappear. They just huddled in the corners, waiting for the evening to come again. I thought about the old man's letter and the way he spoke of the guest. He hadn't been talking about a ghost. He had been talking about an infection of the spirit, a piece of something ancient that hitched a ride on the architecture of our lives. I went back to my room and stayed there for the rest of the day. I didn't want to leave. If I stayed in one place, maybe it would think I was still part of the furniture. Maybe if I stopped looking at the photo, it would lose interest in me. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face. It wasn't just a face anymore. It was a shape in my dreams, a shadow in the corner of my vision, a presence in the very air I breathed. The house seemed to hum with a low-frequency vibration today, a sound so deep it felt like it was coming from my own bones. It was the sound of the earth below us, the old cemetery, and the thing that had been buried there but hadn't stayed down. It was the sound of the guest settling into its new throne. As evening fell, I heard the first moan. It didn't come from the hallway this time. It came from the wall shared with my bedroom. It was a long, drawn-out sound of satisfaction. It sounded like a person exhaling after a very long day, or perhaps it was just the house settling into the night. I sat in my bed and watched as the shadows stretched across the floor. I could see the movement in the corner of my room where the closet met the wall. The shadow didn't move like a shadow should. It moved with purpose. It shifted and stretched, elongating until it looked almost human. Then it stopped. I knew if I turned my head, I would see it. If I looked at it, it would become real in my world. I kept my eyes fixed on the door, my heart thumping a rapid rhythm. I didn't want to be part of its history. I didn't want to be a face in someone else's photograph. I thought about the photo on the living room table. It was still there, waiting for me. In it, the figure in the window was smiling. It wasn't just an expression of joy. It was a welcoming gesture. It was inviting me into its house, into its fold, into its very essence. The moon rose over the trees, casting a silver light through my window. The glass felt cold against my face as I leaned toward it. I could see the reflection of my own face in the pane, and behind it, the shadow in the corner of my room seemed to move closer. It was no longer just a shape. It was becoming a presence. I thought about my parents who were sleeping in the next room, perhaps dreaming of their own fears. They had accepted its existence because they couldn't fight it. They had realized that some things are simply part of the land you live on, and you must find a way to coexist with them. But I wasn't ready to coexist. I wanted to be whole. I looked at the shadow again. It was right there, just beyond the reach of my sight. It was a part of the house now, and because I had seen it, I was becoming a part of it too. The distinction between me and the walls was beginning to blur in my mind. My thoughts were getting heavy, like stones at the bottom of a well. I heard the sound of wood creaking in the hallway. It was slow and deliberate. Someone or something was walking toward my door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited for the handle to turn. The handle didn't turn. Instead, there was a soft tap on the wood. Tap. Tap, the same rhythm as before. It wasn't a stranger at my door. It was the house itself speaking to me. It was the wall, the floor, and the ceiling all whispering in one voice. I lay back on my pillow and closed my eyes, but the image of the face in the window remained burned into my retinas. It was there, etched into my mind like a scar. I could feel it watching me even with my eyes shut. It was part of my vision now. The next morning, I woke up and went to the living room. I sat down at the table and looked at the photograph. My heart skipped a beat. The face in the window wasn't just smiling anymore. It seemed to be looking directly at me, not at my mother, but at me. It had moved from behind the glass to the very front of it. I stood up and walked toward the window. I didn't look at the photo. I looked out at the backyard. The sun was rising, and the mist was still hanging over the grass. For a moment, I felt like the house was breathing with me. I realized that I wasn't just living in a house built on a cemetery. I was becoming part of a legacy I hadn't chosen but had accepted by looking. I looked at my hands and noticed they seemed paler than usual, as if the blood were retreating from the surface. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me, a numbness that started in my fingertips and moved toward my heart. It was the peace of acceptance. The fear was still there, but it was being muffled by something older and more powerful. I walked to the kitchen where my mother was making coffee. She looked at me and smiled, a sad, tired smile. "Did you sleep well?" she asked. "Yes," I said, and for the first time in weeks my voice didn't shake. "I slept very well." She nodded, and as she turned to pour the coffee, I noticed that her shadow on the wall seemed to have a slight flicker at the edge of it, a small distortion like a ripple in water. She knew. They all knew. We were just waiting for the transition to be complete. I went back to the living room and sat by the window. I picked up the photograph and held it up to the light. The face was no longer a surprise. It was an acquaintance. It was a part of our family history now, woven into the fabric of my memories like a thread of dark silk. I looked at the glass above my head. There was no one there today, but I knew they were there. They were in the walls, in the floorboards, and in the very air I breathed. They weren't gone. They had just moved into the spaces between my thoughts. As I sat there, I realized that the house didn't need to be haunted because it was already inhabited. It wasn't a ghost story anymore. It was a reality of architecture. We were not residents of this land. We were guests in its memory. And as long as I kept looking at the photo, I would always have a seat at the table. I looked out at the garden once more and saw a figure standing by the gate, perfectly still under the morning sun. It wasn't a person, but a shape that moved like a reflection. It didn't move toward me. It simply existed there, part of the scenery. Then I realized something that made my breath catch in my throat. If the figure in the window was watching us from the past, who was the figure at the gate watching us in the present? I looked back at the photograph and noticed a small change. There was just one face in the window anymore. There were two. One was still the long-faced thing with the wide grin, but the second one, smaller and more familiar, had appeared beside it. It had my mother's hair and my father's eyes. I looked at my mother as she walked into the room, holding a tray of food. She stopped when she saw me looking at the photo. She didn't look surprised. She just sighed and set the tray down. "It's happening faster than we hoped," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of the boiling kettle. I looked from the photograph to her and then back again. I saw the way the light hit her face, making it seem as though her skin was becoming translucent, like aged parchment. "Is it?" I asked. She didn't answer. She just sat down across from me and began to pour the coffee, the steam rising in a slow, ghostly spiral. The house seemed to groan in agreement, a deep vibration that started in the floorboards and traveled up through my legs. I looked at the photo one last time before I put it down. The face of the stranger was no longer smiling. It was now mimicking my own expression of shock. It was becoming me, even as I was becoming part of its house. The question wasn't whether the thing in the wall was still there. The question was how much of me was left to be consumed by the wood and stone. I looked at the window and saw my own reflection beginning to blur at the edges, blending into the grain of the frame. If I look closer at the photo, can I see my face appearing in the glass?